The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Christiaan Gevers Deynoot. I'm from South Pole, and we very much look forward to today's event, CO2 Transport and Storage, a global multi-gigaton climate necessity. Now, I would suggest that we take it away, really. We have 1 hour for the audacious task of tackling this question. And it is a complicated question. And we believe it is also a very timely question, not only because it is the 27th COP these weeks, but also because we believe it is the quintessential piece to reaching the scale of carbon removals that science tells us we should reach. Now, before we dive into this and give you a brief introduction of the organizations joining us today and of the topic, I would like to start with a few housekeeping announcements. So please, if we could go to the next slide. So all of you will already have been forced to mute your audio settings. This means that there will not be an opportunity for any live questions. Questions that you want to ask can be put in the questions box, and we'll endeavor to answer them as and when we have the opportunity at the end of this particular webinar, and depending, of course, on the time that we have available. Those questions that we cannot address, we will try to address them later on following this particular webinar. Now, the session will be recorded and shared with you afterwards, and we do advise you and ask you to share it further to spread the good word. Now, without further ado, let us really get cracking. So if we can go to the next slide, I would just like to sort of introduce the panelists in a moment. Before I do that, let me just say a few words, if you allow me, about South Pole, which is the organization hosting today's webinar. Now, for many of you, South Pole may be a familiar name, a household name in the voluntary carbon market. It is a global platform for climate action, and we have been helping companies and countries around the world on their journey towards net zero emissions. Now, in that context, we have helped develop and finance hundreds of different projects to reduce and avoid emissions, and increasingly also to remove emissions, both from more ecosystem-based removal projects and the more engineering-based removal projects. Now, we also have now launched a number of initiatives, or are participating in a number of initiatives that are quite critical to building the market for carbon removals, because in our belief, this market is extremely nascent and requires rapid scale up. Now, some of these initiatives I will list very briefly. One is the next-gen carbon dioxide removal purchase facility, which is a demand and supply side aggregator to help drive down the technology cost curve and the price of carbon removals. Another is the CCS Plus initiative, which is a membership-based association to develop a carbon accounting infrastructure for technical carbon removal projects and conventional carbon capture and storage projects. Now, then there's Airfix, a recently launched subsidiary focused on unlocking a very specific type of carbon removal projects, namely biomass with carbon removal and storage, and these associated value chains. And we are very lucky to have Stephanie Bischof here as the leader of that organization to speak on our panel today. Now, finally, there is the Rethinking Removals Initiative, which is a global non-profit, multi-stakeholder initiative aimed at integrating and initiating multi-sector coalitions focused on unlocking carbon removals. Now, this is just a handful of the efforts that South Pole is engaging on. But what is clear is that none of these initiatives are led or performed solely by South Pole. In fact, they are all collaborations with a multitude of other players, many other critical players that are not only involved in these initiatives, but also out there beyond are driving the current efforts towards scaling the market for carbon removals. And today we are extremely delighted to have 4 of those represented. I already mentioned Stephanie Bischof, the Managing Director of Airfix. Let me introduce to you briefly the other 3 speakers. So we have here Toby Lockwood, who is the Technology and Markets Director at Clean Air Taskforce, which is a globally operating environmental organization focused on the development and deployment of low carbon energy and other climate protection technologies, including carbon removals and conventional CCS. We have Kristinn Ingi Lárusson, Head of Business Development at Carbfix, an academic industrial partnership that is currently pioneering a new form of storage, namely storage in the form of a process of rapid underground mineralization of CO2 that might be captured from the atmosphere or involving fossil emissions, and turning this into rock, into stone underground. And they're also currently working together with Climeworks, a direct air capture company, on the second phase of this organization. Now, finally, last but not least, we have here Carlijn Nouwen, co-founder of Climate Action Platform Africa, which works to help unlock Africa's potential as a global hub for climate action, underpinning a new type of climate smart models of economic growth, including also a focus on increasing livelihoods and economic development. In fact, another co-founder of Carlijn, James Mwangi, just won a multi-million-dollar Climate Breakthrough Award for this particular organization, showcasing both the success and the confidence in its efforts. Now, just to take a step back, these 4 speakers represent various perspectives on the type of projects out there and the specific transport and storage infrastructure needs that exist to unlock that potential. And it is, dearly needed, because science tells us that we need to unlock up to 10 gigatons of carbon removal by 2050 annually to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive as a pathway, and therefore the Paris Agreement targets. Now, we are very far from doing this. We are currently removing less than 1 billion tons of CO2, and of that, an even smaller, way smaller amount of durable removal. That is to say, anything above, let's say, 100 years of storage and more. And therefore, a lot of work is needed for an exponential growth of this market and also of the transport and storage infrastructure. Now, I believe personally that this requires changing our mindsets first and foremost, and I hope that today's conversation will show that. That is a change of mindset from, on the one hand, not looking at carbon removal solutions as siloed, but rather as an overall system of carbon removal. On the other hand, it is about looking at carbon removal as an inclusive endeavor rather than an exclusive endeavor, focusing on very specific projects. We need to have all these projects out there. And so that means ultimately thinking about this with a very open mind, that we need to have as many solutions out there that can draw CO2 from the atmosphere, and as many solutions out there that can store them. And in between, there's transport infrastructure. Now, I've been speaking for way too long, and apologies for that, but I think it is important to set the stage properly. And what we will do now is we will have 4 slides, 1 slide per speaker, which lays out a particular type of carbon removal projects and the kind of transport and storage infrastructure deployment model required to unlock it. We start first with Clean Air Taskforce with Toby Lockwood, that will tell us a little bit more about, amongst others, the hub and spoke approach for industrial CCS and large-scale carbon dioxide removal. Toby, over to you for an initial statement. You're on mute.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think I needed to be unmuted by the organizer, not just me being stupid. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to speak at this event. Really great to be on this panel with so many expert speakers. So yeah, Christiaan has already introduced Clean Air Taskforce a bit. We're a climate NGO originally from the US, founded about 26 years ago, and we've expanded our work to Europe in the last 2 or 3 years. And my focus in Europe is really leading our analytical work to in the field of carbon capture, which we see as a vital technology for enabling the world and Europe to meet its net zero climate goals. Of course, there's two complementary, we would say, aspects to carbon capture as a climate technology. We can reduce emissions, particularly from hard to abate sectors, from industry, and also as a role in achieving permanent carbon dioxide removal, which is what we're talking about today. And that can be either through direct air capture, which is obviously a very nascent stage, and hope to hear more about that from the other panelists. And also there's massive potential for synergies between removals and reductions through the use of bioenergy, providing that is based on biomass, which is sourced and grown in a sustainable and climate beneficial way. So yeah, I think we've seen a huge amount of activity in CCS, particularly for industrial decarbonisation in the last 2 years in Europe, and a lot of it is based around what's shown in the schematic, a hub and spoke, or often called a cluster approach to project development. And this really stems from the fact that we need economies of scale to get costs down for CCS. It's currently a fairly high cost solution. I think some of our analysis has shown that it's not really high cost on a per ton basis, but these are big projects. You get the biggest bang for buck if you capture a lot of carbon at once, but that means high upfront capital costs. And really underpinning that scale of CO2 capture, we need a lot of geological storage, and that's the real bottleneck we're seeing at the moment today in Europe. Based on current storage plans, currently sites that are currently under development, we're looking at 50% shortfall for storage capacity by 2030. So what's vital here is orienting a lot of emission sources or removal points or direct air capture points around shared infrastructure. So the middle circle in the schematic could be a storage site, and we need to feed into the storage site from all the capture points with a range of different transport modalities. At the moment, what we're seeing in Europe is a significant interest in CO2 shipping in particular. The current storage sites under development are largely in the North Sea, and projects like Northern Lights sourcing CO2 from around Europe using shipping. And we're going to hear from Carbfix later. It's also heavily reliant on a shipping solution. So that's why Clean Air Taskforce has been working to include more CO2 transport modalities within key EU regulations like 10E, the Trans-European Network for Energy, and 10T, Trans-European Network for Transport. So we've seen already CO2 storage and CO2 transport by pipelines included under the 10E. Now it's crucial that we get other modalities such as CO2 transport by ship, but also by train, by barge, by trucks under the 10T, which is supposed to complement the 10E with those more mobile transport-based solutions. So I'll sort of wrap up there, but I think it's really crucial to emphasize how many of the projects we're seeing coming forward now for removals and reductions are reliant already on these non-pipeline modalities. And that's because it's something more flexible, low capital intensive that you can get moving very, well, relatively easily. So a number of the projects funded, currently selected for funding under the EU's Innovation Fund, for instance, do rely on shipping, and some also rely on trains and truck transport. So this is something that's happening. We really need a regulatory framework to support those initiatives.
Thank you so much, Toby. Appreciate it. And just one quick follow-up question, if I may. You mentioned the lack of storage capacity as a main challenge, really, to unlocking many of these projects. Why is this such a challenge, and how can this be addressed?
Well, I think it's this perennial chicken and egg problem that people talk about for CCS. There's developing particularly offshore storage sites can be quite require quite a lot of pre-FID developmental funding and a lot of risky investment and exploration and test wells. And it seems like, I mean, this is maybe beginning to change a bit. We're seeing a lot of developments out in the North Sea. There's a lot of CO2 storage licenses being issued by both Norway and the UK. But it really is lagging demand from emitters, and I think that's because potential storage companies really need a lot of confidence that there will be CO2 there to store. And at the moment, even though there's a lot of interest from industries looking to decarbonize across Europe, there's not many places where that's actually backed up by policy to fund those projects. There's just a few. Outside the North Sea countries, there's just a few projects funded by the Innovation Fund, and that's even more the case for removals, where there really isn't, as we know, a mechanism, a financial mechanism to support the volumes we need from CO2 removals. So yeah, you need to really signal definite demand, and the storage development will come. I think that's a political problem.
Understood, and thank you, Toby. And that is an excellent segue, actually, to Stephanie from Airfix, which is heavily engaged in very much unlocking that kind of demand, which may help provide the answer to the challenge that you outlined and how to solve it. Stephanie, over to you, please. Please unmute yourself.
Perfect. Thanks, Christiaan, for the introduction, and thanks, Toby, as well, for these little insights. So at Airfix, we are really working towards activating the market for biogenic carbon removals. So we are helping point source biogenic emitters to set up these projects that Toby was just talking about, and to capture biogenic CO2, store it permanently, and generate CDR removals. Typical emitters are, for instance, waste-to-energy plants, biogas plants, or sewage sludge incinerators. And we are basically helping them to implement a full value chain. This means to capture the CO2, to transport it to a permanent storage site, then certify the carbon removal, and finally also we help them with monetization. We are currently focusing on European emitters. Our first projects are in Switzerland. As Christiaan said before, Airfix is a subsidiary of South Pole. We are enabled by a Migros Pioneer Fund, which is a local retailer fund that supports this type of initiatives. And we currently see two large challenges. And the first one really points to what we are talking about today. Suitable CO2 transport options at scale are basically missing. And the second challenge is that we don't see safe enough revenue streams to enable large investment decisions. And we are very glad today. I think it's very important that we address this topic of transport, because as long as we don't have CO2 use cases that permanently store large quantities of CO2 here, or local storage sites, which are also far in the future, we need to transport the CO2 in the most efficient way. And Toby mentioned before, the first options of storage are in the north of Europe. And as you can imagine, being in Switzerland, in the middle of continental Europe, it takes quite an effort to get the CO2 up there. So transporting CO2 today is not only complicated, but it's really also expensive. And this is not only true for Switzerland, but also for other countries without maritime access. And we rely, as you can see here on the slide, on a multi-modular transport system. So in the most difficult cases, first a lorry is used to transport the CO2 to the next train station, and then trains are used to bring the CO2 up to the ports. And from there, you could bring it with a ship to the storage sites that are available. So this is, you can imagine that the handling of CO2 in between the different modes of transport is pretty complicated. But I think, you know, there's a large point to make this case, because there's a large case for point source capture. It's a pretty efficient way of capturing the CO2, and it has proven technology. So we are in quite an advanced stage of technology already today, and there is frankly countless point sources all across the world in different hard to abate emission sectors. So this is a vast potential. I can only quote one number from the ETH Zurich, which says that we could capture 200 million tons in Europe only with BECCS, so only with the biogenic sources. This doesn't include the cement plants or the steel plants. And just to finish with some numbers, Christian, you said in your ingoing statement that the amounts that we are capturing today and last year are pretty limited. So technologically captured and permanently stored CO2 in 2021 was around 70,000 tons. And if I compare these two point source projects, you can see how much potential there is. We are currently working with our first project in the surrounding of Zurich. This is a waste to energy plant, a small waste to energy plant, and it emits annually 30,000 tons. If you look at the medium-sized waste to energy plants, this is 100,000 tons. If you look at the larger waste to energy plant or cement plant, you're in the many 100,000 tons per year. So there's a vast amount out there to capture, and I think this should happen as soon as possible. And for that, we need adequate transport options.
Thank you, Stephanie, for laying that out for us, and you know, the potential that is out there if we start looking at the variety of projects that you described. Now, as a quick follow-up question, you mentioned the transportation challenges that are so critical in this particular case, and connecting up really with those storage sites, providing that demand that Toby outlined as well as such a great need. Now, how can we scale this transportation system if there's such a variety of very specific transportation needs out there? It might be very difficult to reach those kind of economies of scale. What would be your solution to this particular challenge, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, what I found surprising is that even with trains, you can transport a significant amount of tons. So we checked with the Swiss rail, for instance, and they told us that you could capture up to a couple of 100,000 tons. So given that today we hardly transport any of the CO2 from the project, this is significant. Obviously, what is the disadvantage related to this multi-modular transport system is really the cost and the complexity of the transport, because you don't only need, for instance, the train itself, but you need the intermediate storage options. You need isotainers or tracks, new rail tracks. And then, I mean, this is for the first couple of projects. But then to really scale it up, a pipeline network is needed, and there are already now workshops going on in different parts of Europe. There are also already concrete efforts, not only workshops going on, because ultimately for transporting the vast amounts that we need, going into the millions and multi-millions, pipeline is for sure the most economic, but also the most cost efficient. So economic energy-wise, but also cost-wise.
Understood. And so there is effectively a temporal element to how much we rely on different forms of transport.
Totally, yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate it. Now, of course, a lot of that CO2, will ultimately have to end up at a storage site, because otherwise we cannot really start speaking about carbon removals, right? And so, Kristinn, we have you here to address that very question. How do you actually receive all that CO2, and how do you deal with that complexity that has been outlined? And please, you have here a slide that has an attempt, at least towards giving some understanding, however simplistic, of the complexity that you're dealing with. Please take it away.
Okay, I'm here. Hi, thanks for this, Christiaan, and thanks for the invite. Yes, so just in short, for the audience to know who we are at Carbfix. So Carbfix, we capture CO2 into stone underground in less than 2 years through our proprietary technology, where we are simply imitating what Mother Nature has done for millions of years. So in this case, we use the basaltic rock here in Iceland. We take the CO2 and we dissolve it up in water, and then we inject it gently into the ground, where it starts to mineralize and becomes part of the rock. So it becomes a permanent solution. So we're not storing it in that sense, but we are mineralizing it into the bedrock, so it has no chance of resurfacing. So in Iceland, we have been, well, we always say in a funny way that we are a three-year-old startup with about 16 years of research history. So that's kind of where we are. But at the same time, we are running 3 operations here in Iceland and scaling up. And that was the intention with the technology. So we are currently operating at our sister company site, Hellisheiði, on power, where we are actually capturing through our proprietary technology with the focus on the mineralization. But we are actually mineralizing from that facility, a geothermal energy facility, where the kind of, we can say, at the point source. And then we take the CO2. We are fully agnostic in terms of what form, what industry we're working with. So we're not limited to the geothermal. At the same time, we're also not limited to Iceland, because basaltic rock is in various places across the globe. So at this site, we are working and started our original, let's say, pilot by using the Hellisheiði geothermal plant, where we are currently and have injected over 100,000 tons of CO2 into the bedrock. We are also, just over a year ago, in September last year, we opened, or our colleagues at Climeworks opened the Orca facility, which is the world's first DAC site. And we actually received the CO2 from Climeworks. And we then mix it with water, and then we inject it into the bedrock. So there you have 2 different technologies, one being from the emitter and the other one directly from ambient air. The third path that we are focusing on is going to be the mineral storage or transport to storage site. That is actually which we were awarded this summer from the European Innovation Fund, a project called the Coda Terminal. That's going to be the world's largest mineral storage site. It's going to be, let's say, it's a totally different method than the traditional way of storing through enhanced oil recovery. As I explained before, we are mineralizing into the bedrock itself. So the idea with this new facility, the Coda Terminal, is first and foremost to receive CO2 from emitters across Europe, whether it's going to be in mainland Europe or the UK, and then that CO2 will be transported via large tankers to Iceland. So these tankers are going to be built by our partner Deynoot, transported from various routes to Iceland, and let's say the injection capacity of the Coda Terminal, when it will be in full operation, will be around 3 million tons per year. So that's going to be a quite significant amount. So we are agnostic in terms of where we will receive the CO2. Of course, we will be very selective. We want to focus on the hard-to-abate sector, where the need is the most. But in that sense, we are creating a new industry, and that's kind of a we understand and recognize that we need all the technologies. This is just one of the technologies that is out there, and we do appreciate all the other technologies. We have a technology, not the technology, and I want to focus on and emphasize on that. But this is definitely a technology that needs to be looked at and can play a role, whether it's on the CCS market or the CTR market.
Thank you, Kristinn, for sharing this overview of the kind of project value chains that you are effectively looking at as Carbfix, and outlining in a bit more detail the technology that you offer, which is indeed a technology that seems to have, for all intents and purposes, the longest duration of storage there. Now, having said that, what particular challenges do you currently see in capitalizing on these three types of project value chains and accessing them, or effectively unlocking their full potential?
Well, obviously, policy is always going to be the biggest obstacle. I think that everyone agrees on that, and hopefully we will see that change. You know, the sooner the better. Rome was not built in one night, so we anticipate it will take some time. But at the same time, it's about educating the policymakers. It's about educating people about new technologies, and it's about informing them the possibilities. This is not Mother Nature's way of storing CO2. So what we are doing, we're simply speeding up that process and replicating, and this you know, has been proven that this happens in less than 24 months. So I would say policy one, of course. Then you come to the infrastructure. Before, you know, Stephanie mentioned the challenges in Switzerland. We actually have a collaborative project in Switzerland. We are actually receiving CO2 from Switzerland, where it's, you know, taken in a lorry to the train station, and then with a train in an ISO container to the harbor of Rotterdam, where a vessel picks it up, sails with it in the container to Iceland. We pick it up there, and we take it to our Helguvík site, where we will inject it into the ground, into the bedrock, using actually seawater, which is a second level of our let's say Carbfix 2.0. So the challenge is learning. The challenge is, you know, because the next time we'll do it, we know so much better. It's like when you build your first house, the second one will always be better and cheaper. And coming to, you know, each project, you know, as long as we learn how to do it better and better and better, it will become cheaper and cheaper and more let's say accessible for everyone.
Thank you, Kristinn. Appreciate it, and I fully endorse the analogy that we are building a city here of carbon removals, and that the foundation will improve over time. Now, however, you know, there are differences of particular geographical, economic, and social circumstances out there. Will no doubt also have different implications for the kind of transport and storage infrastructure and deployment models for carbon removal projects that can be successful. And I think, Carlijn, maybe this is a good segue also to you to outline a little bit how you see that play out in the case of the type of projects that you see as promising in Kenya and Sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps more widely.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christiaan. Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. So this picture looks deceptively simple after what we've just seen, and that's not because this is necessarily so much simpler in Africa, but the challenge in Africa is a different one. So in the largest part of Africa, current emission levels, and particularly concentrated industrial emission levels, are very, very low. And most of the countries that get a lot of attention in Western newspapers are those countries. So Egypt is the bigger one in North Africa. South Africa obviously has a very big just transition question and has a high emission, current emission profile, as does Nigeria. But those are but one archetype. The vast majority of African countries has really low intensity economies. And the emission intensity, and the entire continent of Africa has really low emission levels, only about 3% of global emission levels. So the question in Africa is less, how do we get rid of these point source emissions that we have in industrial environments? But the question in almost all of Africa is, how do we get to inclusive, equitable, lasting growth without getting to commensurate growth in emissions? And here is where actually removals is incredibly interesting, because the things that Kristinn described that you need for mineralized storage are actually available quite abundantly in the Rift Valley, a big part of which is in Africa. So that kind of rock, combined with the availability of geothermal energy, is actually abundantly available, and Kenya has more installed geothermal capacity than Iceland does, just by virtue of the size of the country, and has not tapped into the vast majority of its proven capacity. So when you think about storing CO2 in sub-Saharan Africa, you can start from scratch in many ways, and you should do this where the potential for atmospheric capture and storage is the greatest, which means where you find the right levels of renewable energy potential, the right storage conditions, whether it's the basaltic porous rock for mineralization, or whether it's the saline aquifers with the right rock, other types of storage as is currently already being done in Algeria. And then you can get the nuclei of removal systems that you see here on the picture, where you put the capture right where you put the storage. There's really no reason to put them separate from one another, because you can choose where you do the capture because you don't have an existing large set of emissions. Of course, there are some industries, and particularly local cement manufacturing, that will probably grow. And that's probably, if you think about the big industrial emitters, that's one of the few for which there is no completely green process available just yet. And there is, for example, for steel and many others for primary processing. So you would look towards developing those industries, hopefully as close as possible to the places where you would store the CO2 anyway, because of atmospheric capture and storage. But really the criteria that drive when you put that, and therefore for the questions around the infrastructure, are anchored around the depth, the breadth, the breadth. In addition, for a number of these African countries, the biggest drivers of their emissions are actually highly decentralized emission drivers, so manure management, urea, fertilizer, land use change. For them, the solution is less likely to be converted into CO2 and store the CO2, but more decentralized solutions that actually create other benefits as well, such as decentralized biochar production, which can then help in the soil fertility restoration for smallholder farmers. So it's really driven by the emission profile of the country, and we think Africa really has the potential to be a real industrial hub of removal. Over to you, Christiaan. You're probably going to ask me about the biggest challenge there, right? We don't have to put transport in place once it's hard to get done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, thank you so much, Carlijn, and surely, indeed, I had a kind of challenge in terms of unlocking this kind of project, and in particular, of course, that the specific type of carbon removal projects that you mentioned, because I understand as well from working together with you and colleagues in other organizations, that it also requires a different type of thinking on the kind of revenue or based model or the financial model to unlock these projects. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this.
Yes. So the most important challenge around these kind of energy-intense models, such as that and mineralized storage, is actually that, unlike in other parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, you need to develop this and the demand for renewable energy in conjunction with each other. So there's this really weird paradox in the majority of African countries where there is massive untapped renewable energy potential. Lots of hundreds of millions of people are energy poor, don't have access to reliable energy, and the energy is expensive. And those three things coexist because there is no bankable investment case for the energy generation investments. Like connecting largely remote, low-income consumers is not a bankable investment case. In fact, the world over, remote rural consumers get subsidized electricity prices that are subsidized through an energy system that has urban use as an industry model so that we can get everybody access to energy. The same thing needs to be developed in Africa. So what you need to do is actually develop that anchor industrial demand, which that really can be, and develop that in parallel to developing the energy generation. So instead of having a potential investor in new geothermal capacity say, you know, I'm not going to invest because there's not really demand, so let the demand come first, and then I might actually set up a program. Whilst in parallel, the energy intensive industry says we're not going to come to Kenya because the power is expensive and not available. That's two people standing around the same pool asking the others to jump in first. If you can actually bring them together and say, let's develop this as an integrated project, it actually makes the investability much easier. When you look at it as the main source of revenue being removal credits, they are sold in dollars or euros, so you actually remove some of the currency risk. You suddenly start looking at a kind of investment model and risk profile that investors are much more comfortable with, global north investors are much more comfortable with, and this conjoined development of supply and demand suddenly becomes an investable proposition. But if you continue to look at these two separate things, and you expect the energy system to solve itself separate from the industry system, then we'll continue standing around the pool and we won't jump in and this industry will not take off.
Thank you, Carlijn. This is immensely interesting, and I think this particular catalytic effect of carbon removal in the form of driving economic development, commercial opportunities is is a fascinating one, and it's not always replicated elsewhere. And I believe, especially since today, or what is it, tomorrow, I think we are officially reaching 8 billion people in the world, and the growth of the population in Africa in particular is, of course, set to continue quite steeply for some time to come. These type of projects that can stimulate such economic development are no doubt more than welcome. Now, having said that, and thanks everybody for your initial interventions. I know we are well on the way, but these are very interesting angles that you have showcased. May I ask the organizers to take down the presentations and slides and just open up so that everybody can see our faces fully. Now we are still engaged in the conversation, so no need to thank you just yet. Now I will ask a few targeted questions, if I may, and then see if we can open up for some questions from the audience. Now, first and foremost, Stephanie, I wanted to ask you to break down in a little bit more detail what are the type of projects that Airfix is looking at, the type of BiCRS or biomass and carbon removal projects that you're looking at. You mentioned already waste to energy plants, but I'd imagine that there's quite a variety of other projects out there. Please, if you could share that.
Yeah, so it's everything that where biogenic material is processed, basically. So the waste to energy plants here in this particular area are currently very motivated, let's say, to set up projects because they made an agreement with the government that until 2030, medium-sized plants is being set up with a full value chain to transport and store, so everything included. But we don't only work with projects in waste to energy, but also there is a biogas plant close to Zurich. There is sewage sludge incineration. There is wood incineration. So there is all sorts of projects where you process biogenic matter, and also let's keep in mind waste to energy is not only biogenic, but it's only half biogenic, which in terms of negative emissions makes, or in terms of monetizing the negative emissions makes it a bit more complicated. But I think in terms of transport, what we really see as a challenge is if you have smaller emitters, and these projects are usually very interesting to demonstrate the feasibility or also to pilot certain technologies. Usually they are not connected to the main transport lines in terms of the rail, so it becomes quite complicated in terms of transportation when you have to organize the lorries, and if you have a couple of lorries every day coming in, it becomes also very tangible how this type of project looks like. However, then if you have projects as of 30,000-40,000 tons per year, sometimes it's even possible to build a new rail to the transport to the emitter sites to enable more efficient transport options.
Understood, and thank you. And imagine that the particular valuation of carbon removal, the price effectively, and the business case will no doubt be a driver of an accelerated deployment of such variety of infrastructure modes. Now, I'm sure that this cannot be done by the private sector alone. And maybe Toby, could you elaborate a little bit from your point of view how you think that the public and private sector, could best work together in enabling this multi-layered transport and storage infrastructure over time? Please unmute yourself.
Right, sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, there's a key role for the public sector in, can you hear me? Yeah? Yeah, good. Yes, there's definitely a major role for the public sector to play in both in creating the demand for removals, which isn't, at the moment is really underpinned by the voluntary market. And I think we need the public sector, and it's not quite what you asked, but I think first and foremost, we need to create demand for removals, and that's really going to come through the public sector introducing rigorous certification for what constitutes removal, what constitutes a durable removal, and really that can create the added value which we know is there for long-term removals, such as provided by CCS technologies. But on the transport side, there's also a key role, particularly in Europe, for optimizing and planning the infrastructure which is needed on a cross-border basis. At the moment, there's a lot of regulatory, technical barriers to moving CO2 across borders for storage. So there's a really important role for the EU in a bit like happened under the hydrogen strategy, planning a kind of trans-European network for CO2 storage, and thereby stimulating investor interest and confidence in creating that network. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of public-private partnerships involved in developing, and we need to decide. I think this will happen on a member state basis as well, but there's a diverse set of models under which you can share ownership of CO2 storage sites, how that industry is regulated. But yeah, we'll see varying roles for the public sector in storage ownership and governance as the sector develops.
Understood. And I hear you loud and clearly when it comes to the responsibility of the public sector to set the framework conditions, really, and at the same time the need for almost flexible kind of public-private sector initiatives or coalitions to answer to the specific challenges of transport and storage in particular locations. Now, perhaps, Kristinn, since Carbfix is of course the recipient of a lot of the CO2 that comes through a variety of transport means ultimately to the storage site that you operate, to what extent should or do you take account in a way of the emissions that are generated along the value chain over time? Because I imagine that these transport modes all have their own carbon footprint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. Of course, this is, we practice what we preach. So we have to account for that as well. So, for example, in the quota terminal, when we built that model up, we are anticipating to use green fuel, for example, in that journey from mainland Europe. So, and that comes into the transition or the energy transition. What is available? What kind of green fuel will be available? That comes into account of what type of engines will be picked for the vessels and so on. So yes, of course, full life cycle analysis of the project needs to be enforced. So we would not not be true to ourselves if we wouldn't encounter for that. But that comes back to what I mentioned originally. We are focusing on 3 different paths. You know, obviously it will be best if the geological conditions are in that sense that we can actually mineralize where the emitter is, like Carlijn mentioned before. For example, in Kenya, I mean, it has a very it's very good from a geological point of view. So that could be an ideal place to store CO2, just like Iceland is. But I mean, 5% of land on the Earth is actually covered in basalt, so, and about 70% of the ocean floor. So, but all these things need to be put into the equation.
Thank you. And is there a particular ratio, Kristinn, that you're looking at of the, let's say, emissions along the value chain versus the amount of CO2 removed?
So there was some noise behind. Can you repeat that?
Is there a particular ratio that you're looking at of the amount of emissions along the transportation value chain versus the CO2 that is ultimately removed when we're talking about CO2 removal?
Well, I mean, from a ratio point of view, of course, we want the emission to be the highest, so we leave the least footprint behind. There's no defined, but of course we aim that the net amount will be almost as close to zero as possible. Of course, there will always be something, a few percentages, but I don't have that exact figure right now. But you know, we're talking very few percentages.
Of course, understood. Thank you. So let me. I mean, we're reaching close to the end of this webinar. About a bit less than 10 minutes to go. And I wanted to ask you, Carlijn. I mean, you clearly outlined the business opportunity that carbon removals offer in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, amongst others, and its catalytic effect on economic development. Now, how can we, or how can the world effectively unlock that business opportunity and the kind of investment and financing that is needed? And I would like to ask you, if that is all right, to to pull in some of the aspects that the President of Kenya, President Ruto, included in his speech just now at COP.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christiaan. And for those of you who have not seen President Ruto's speech, he spoke very compellingly about Kenya's ambition to be driving its energy or its economic growth based on renewable energy growth, from a rate of 3 gigawatts now to in 2040, so from 3 to 100, which is something I think very few other countries in the world aspire to, and all of that renewable, and on the back of that, driving a very wide of economic activities, from the green hydrogen and green ammonia plants that was also announced this week in a contract between Kenya and Fortescue Future Industries, to carbon removal, to synthesizing fuels, you name it. So what the world can do is a couple of things. Obviously, consider and take Africa seriously as an investment destination, and don't turn away when at first glance it doesn't look like what you're used to. So actually be very explicit about what it is you need, and then seek out partners that can help you solve for that. The question we actually ask most of our partners and stakeholders most when we engage with them is, what was your most cynical board member raise against an investment case in Africa? Can you just list all the things that they're worried about, that they think won't work, whether it's perceived, whether it's real, so we can actually start working through which of these are real, and if they're real, how can we actually bring in solutions, how can we bring in de-risking, how can we bring in partnerships, etc. So take it seriously as a destination, as an investment opportunity, and don't turn away immediately if it doesn't look like what you are used to, because it will look differently, but that doesn't mean that it won't work. The second thing is a lot more technical, but no less important, which is design both trade, regulation, and fiscal incentives in a way that generates as much as possible a level playing field that allows for globally efficient capital allocation. Sorry, there's a lot of background noise where I am. I hope you can see it hearing me. So if you look at, for example, the recent incentives brought in the US with 45Q and IRA, that actually has made the US a hyper attractive location for that as the next as an expectation. We're hearing from a lot of players in the industry that is trumping many other criteria that they currently have. Thinking about that in a creative way, and for example, thinking about, would you be able to extend the same tax benefits to a US company if they deployed their technology in Africa, provided that the credits came with the corresponding adjustments and was able to count towards the US achieving its tendency? Right? You can actually make the argument that that still helps US industry, it helps US industry be forward-leaning as this industry takes on an international growth path, and therefore why not actually use some of the fiscal incentives that US has put in place to expanding that to other regions, provided again that the US gets the benefits it needs. Similarly, some of the debates that are currently happening around Article 6 in voluntary carbon markets around the compulsory or non-compulsory attachment of corresponding adjustments, all of those are like super technical, but many of them have the potential to either create a real level playing field that allows the locations with the inherent best intrinsic value for money around sort of cost per ton stored and the co-benefits that come with it to come to the fore, or potentially actually distort that level playing field and put a location that can play a massive role in solving our climate challenge at the best of its use, simply because these countries cannot afford to give the same level of incentives or put protective measures in place.
Thank you, Carlijn. Much appreciated for that. And it clearly shows that the need to look across borders when it comes to developing solutions to unlock the potential of removals across the world and across different geographies and across different economies. Now, there's one particular question from the audience. I've tried to integrate some of the questions already, but there's one I would like to end with because it does refer to the end station of the CO2. And so, Kristinn, I do end with you, if you allow me, which is, as you know, when it comes to CO2 storage, there is often a fear amongst the wider public as to what happens to the CO2 over time. And equally with your solution, as with other forms of CO2 storage in geological formations. Now, in your particular case, the technology of Carbfix, you know, as you transform the CO2 into rock, do you take account of the risk of rock fracturing or fracturing of the geological formations on the ground? How does that work, really?
So when the project started in 2006, it was a collaboration between three universities: University of Iceland, Columbia University in New York, and CNRS out of Toulouse in France. With the mind that being able to replicate what Mother Nature has been doing for millions of years. So that research, what surprised people the most was that we managed to demonstrate through science that and replicate and speed up Mother Nature's way of storing CO2 into the bedrock or mineralizing into the bedrock and taking all risk into considerations. Carbfix has published over 100 papers on the subject and peer-reviewed papers and articles. So we have, this is not something that we came out a year ago. This is, you know, almost 20 years of research. So you know, science does not lie. So this is something that has been very, very thoroughly gone through back and forth. And we have been operating here on an industrial scale in Iceland since 2012. So I hope that answers the question.
I hope so too. Thank you so much, Kristinn. Much appreciated. Now, we have reached the end of our webinar today. I believe that we could continue speaking about this particular challenge, namely the transport and storage infrastructure to unlocking the scale of removals that science tells us we should unlock for, you know, hours, if not days to come. But unfortunately, we don't have that opportunity today. So, you know, we'll come back to you on that in the future. In the meantime, though, I would like to leave you, well, first of all, thank all the speakers for their amazingly interesting interventions today. Please do follow these four organizations, as they are doing great things out there in trying to solve the conundrum of scaling carbon removals exponentially. And I would like to share with the audience, you know, one final thought, and and that is the following, which is that, you know, as we are engaging with this challenge globally as a global society, you know, we need to understand also that different places, different circumstances offer different opportunities when it comes to unlocking climate action, including on carbon removals. Now, if we do not fit the pieces of the puzzle to those opportunities as they are, you know, as they fit most efficiently, such as the transport and storage infrastructure, we will not be able to reach the scale that we need to stave off the challenge before us. So with that parting thought, thank you so much, everyone, and we look forward to having you again at this venue in the future. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.